Attention! Attention! Action this day.
Yeah, that's more like it.
Hello, we have. That's more like it, isn't it? Hello, we have Ways listeners. Today, James and I. Well, it's the first of our most important week in history specials. Yes, that's right.
We think it's
not
that
the week
important.
of the first test at Lord's. Yeah, it is that important. We're talking about Dunkirk, about the evacuation at Dunkirk. And we're offering you 8 days of this scintillating content with guests offering their opinions, people who really know what they're talking about as well. I mean, if you've got the Navy's historian on, you're talking to the right person, I think. I noticed, James, that you have a ladder now with your library in the background there.
Well, I always had the ladder, but it was just further down. But I've just invested in a new bike, and because it's new and shiny, I don't want to put it out in the back of the house. So it's in the study with me. But yeah, so I have brought my ladder in, but it doesn't slide across like Steve's does.
Yeah. Well, yes, that's Steve Prince, who we will be talking to later about the naval contribution to the miracle of Dunkirk. I mean, before we go back, I think one thing that's worth saying is when it's described as the miracle of Dunkirk, that's not hyperbole, and that's not myth. That's not myth making, and that's not clinging to some rosy tinted view of what happened. It is undoubtedly a military miracle. I mean, it's a thing as we'll talk about that the British were capable of doing. You know, it's not like they had to build the ships to do it and all that sort of thing.
Everything's in place,
the gear
isn't
at their
it?
disposal. Yeah.
But there's a huge amount of luck involved.
Without the expectation. Yeah, without the expectation they're ever going to have to do a thing like this ever. But so let's set the scene. So
we're starting with Sunday the 26th of May, and I think the thing that kind of really strikes me about this week is just that, you know, the fact that it's a national day of prayer on Sunday the 26th of May kind of suggests that they're kind of up the creek and they haven't got a paddle and they've got not much else to kind of revert to. And by the end of the week, kind of things have turned around. You know, it's so much happens in the following 7 days. And in that time, at the start of that week, as we shall see, you know, Britain really is staring down the barrel. It is absolutely on the brink.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing is because that's because of political machinations rather than actually pure military factors.
Yeah.
But there is a huge amount of luck in the whole week. You know, the fact that the sea, the channel is kind of dead calm for literally the whole 7-8 days. The fact
but with cloud cover that inconveniences the Luftwaffe.
Absolutely.
So it's like, how the hell do you get that combination?
Yeah.
You know, I mean,
and for that stretch of time. And of course Hitler's halt order of the Panzers, which gives us the chance to kind of actually create a perimeter around Dunkirk and actually defend it. Because once you've got behind the perimeter, actually that's a pretty good defensive line. I mean so basically, for those who don't know, there's a sort of canal that goes from kind of sort of Belgium inland a few miles and kind of goes south all around Dunkirk, and that is a really formidable barrier to anyone trying to get. And of course, what you can't do is you can't send tanks across it because all the bridges are blown. The only way that you're going to get across it is for infantry to get across and then bridge it, and then you can send your panzers over. And
the infantry haven't come up yet, of course, which is the reason
some of
for the
the
halt
infantry
order
have
after
come
all.
up. Some of the infantry have come up from Army Group B,
but not in sufficient numbers for the Germans to be confident to really do anything, which is what's led to the halt order after all, which is why von Rundstedt gets cold feet, which then transmit to Hitler, who issues the order, and then you've got the thing of when the halt order's rescinded, you've got generals going, well, I'm not going to do it yet until the very last minute because I'm in charge here, thank you very much, not anyone else. And you've got all that sort of electric static going on in the German command system.
But the big thing is that had the Panzers been allowed to just keep going, they would have got in behind the BF, or the vast majority of the BF, before they had got in and organised themselves behind the perimeter. The reason the perimeter is so well defended is because the infantry that are doing that defence have had the time to organise themselves. We talk a lot about balance and being off balance. They are totally off balance at the beginning of that period, sort of 24th, 23rd of May. They are on balance again by the time it comes to the halt order being lifted on the 28th of May. But we are jumping the gun because we were going to do.
Yeah, and later in the week, we're going to talk about what happens to the battalion, one of the battalions
Yes.
that basically doesn't make it back.
Yes.
And the experience of kind of being outside the thing, trying to hold the Germans up before the perimeter coalesces. Because I think that you know, aside from the naval miracle, that you're touching on something really important here is the BEF. You know, set off on very end of May the 10th, May the 11th, with their plan, with the Grand Allied plan, that what you're going to do is meet what turns out to be the feint
Yep.
in Belgium, and exactly, and the Belgians have blown hot and cold about whether they're going to help anyway, or how actually useful they're going to be to the Allies. By staying neutral and then eventually throwing their lot in. So that picture's complex in itself. The plan is executed. It turns out to, you know, that you know, whether it's a feint or not, they're flanked. So you know, it doesn't matter whether it's a feint or not.
I think it's worth just going back because the decision is the assumption is that what the Germans will do if and when they attack, they're going to attack through the Low Countries, because to attack through the Ardennes is full of hills and rivers and narrow roads. And they haven't got and the much vaunted Nazi war machine, i.e. panzers, half tracks, all that kind of stuff, won't be able to get through the Ardennes because it's too narrow and all the rest of it. And so that is discounted.
But also, you know, the much vaunted Nazi war machine, after all, is a thing that actually really kind of comes after this. I mean, in Poland, everyone knows it's an unequal struggle.
Yes.
The expectation here is that this is sort of that in fact the Allies are more than evenly matched with the Germans.
Right.
That's the Allied expectation.
So the French are overall. So the overall military commander is General Maurice Gamelin, who is the commander in chief of the. I mean, he's equivalent of kind of the chief of the Imperial General Staff, the most senior military figure in France, and his plan, in cahoots with the British, but they are very much the senior partner, is that is what the Germans are going to do, because that's what they always do. Even though they actually don't, because they crossed the River Meuse at Sedan in 1870 and again in 1914. But anyway, be that as it may. Then there is the Mechelin incident where they pick up the plans, and the original German plans are exactly that. They are to come through the Low Countries, because that's the easiest bit for motorised, for mechanised machinery. And so they assume that is true. And of course, that is what prompts Halder, who is the chief of staff of the German army, to go, actually, no, this whole going through the Ardennes thing actually does have some merit, and completely changing it. But trying to persuade the Allies that the original plan, going for the Low Countries, is what they're going for. So it's an envelopment. So the Gamelin's plan is to move up to the River Dyle. Now, they can't go into Belgium until German troops enter Belgium, because Belgium is neutral, and Belgium won't allow them to make forts or defensive positions on the Belgian-German border or Dutch border or anything, because that's not what neutral people do. The counter-argument to that is, actually, you go, fine, but don't worry about the Belgians then. Okay, we'll do without their 20 divisions, and we'll do without the kind of 15 divisions of the Dutch and the Belgian Air Force. We'll just stay on the French border, because actually there's rivers on the French border as well. The problem is that is very close to the industrial heartland, or around Lille in that northern French area. And of course, there is still the psychological scar of having much of the war being fought on French soil in 1914-18. So that is very, very quickly dismissed, even though that would have been a much more sensible idea. It's a much more practical idea, but it's not an emotional idea.
Or the politics
idea
of it and all that. Because after all, we very rarely actually talk about politics on this podcast. No. We float into the fourth sphere, which is actually what you can do politically.
Right.
We tend to get no further up than strategic, which after all, sometimes is an expression of politics, and sometimes it simply isn't. It's an expression of what you can do because you're committed to fighting war. But the politics comes in here, and but as you say, so the French are running the thing. The plan is this deal line.
You've got this hinge. So the interesting thing is you've got the famous Maginot Line, or infamous Maginot Line, which clearly the Germans they've got to get across the Rhine, and then they've got to get across the Maginot Line. The Maginot Line is, to all intents and purposes, impregnable. So they're not going to do that. Then there is the hinge, where you suddenly the line, the boundary kind of turns northwestwards, and that is a flexible hinge. And the actual hinge is Sedan, which is across the River Meuse. And so the idea is that what they'll do is they'll advance up to the River Dyle. And the River Dyle is like 60, 70 miles north. Then there is this extra plan, which is to go up into Holland, which involves moving an entire army from the Central Reserve up onto the kind of western flank. And by the time it's actually moved up to this position on the western flank of the Allied position, the Germans have already kind of sort of overrun it. So the whole thing is a complete
Yeah.
But as it is, although the warning is the moment the Germans attack, we're off. In actual fact, even the British don't really get going till lunchtime, even though the warnings have been since kind of 4 a.m. And it's just a bit too late. And so by the time they actually get to the Dyle, no sooner do they get to the Dyle, then the Belgians on the British left and the 55th, it's not the 55th French division, I can't remember which French division it is, that's neither here nor there, but the French division on their right, both have started to fall back. So they then fall back to the next river line, which is the Escaut. And the Escaut is one of those rivers that's been straightened into a canal. So it's dead straight. It's about 30, 40 yards wide. It's a very, very good defensive position. And actually,
it's an excellent defensive position.
And the BEF do really well there, because actually the Germans at one point get across the River Escaut and they kick them back and shove them back across the river. Yeah. But then again, the French and the British are collapsing either side. And of course, the southern flank now has been exposed because Army Group A has come through the Ardennes. They have crossed the River Meuse in 3 days. They've reached the River Meuse in 3 days and crossed it in 4. In actual fact, they do just about at just north of Dinant. They do actually get across on the night of the 12th. And so they. The whole of the southern bit is just collapsed. There's this huge hole blown in the French line around Sedan, Dinant and Monthermé. And it's unrecoverable. And the problem is because the French can't move quickly, then the Germans are able to take them out in penny packets. They're absolutely stymied by this incredibly top-heavy control system, command and control system, which doesn't involve quick comms, and that's the problem.
And also problems of coherence, because their soldiers in preparation for the war have been the infantry have been being used to build fortifications. They've been doing agricultural work.
Yes,
they've not been training, and they're not match fit. And if the Germans have figured out one thing, it's that you need people well trained, and you need that all joined up, especially in the sharp end of your advance. So what you end up with is where Sedan's popped open, and they start to flank the BEF, is you've got not really good French soldiers in such an important position, and they're not ready for it. And you get French officers going, well, we don't have coherence here, and you look at why, and it's because they haven't been training right, and also they have a rotation thing, which they get from Verdun, which is the experience of the First World War, where you need to rotate people in and out because they're going to get worn out at the front. So no one knows anybody, and they're all in. You talk about the Germans picking off the French in penny packets. The French are in penny packets, because that's how they've been running their line. So it's little wonder really that when the Germans, who a bank basically putting everything on black, aren't they?
Yeah.
And are gambling everything. Have got the sharp end people who've got their shit together. It's sort of what happens.
I think you can think of there's 5 reasons why it fails for the French, and subsequently the Belgians and Dutch and the British in France. The first one is the lack of political unity in France at the time. So I think there's something like 13 coalition governments, and the current government has only been in for a couple of months, and Paul Reynaud is Prime Minister. No one likes him, although actually he's pretty good. He's politically largely impotent. I think there's something like 12 different parties within it, and because it's not a kind of Lib Dem Tory coalition where actually you can still make decisions. You cannot make any decisions because no one can agree on anything, and when you do finally agree on anything, it's a horrible compromise that no one wants. And the problem is if your political masters don't have that kind of strength of vision and will, your military commanders are similarly kind of to a large extent impotent. Then I think the second problem with the French is that the commanders are just too old. They're all in their 60s. Weygand, who takes over from Gamelin, is 73 3 or 4 or something.
Yeah.
Petain himself is over 80. So, they're just not, German and British commanders are all late 40s, early 50s. And that tenure difference is actually quite substantial, because you're constantly having to deal with a huge flow of information, and your job, the higher you go up the command, is to make fewer decisions, but the fewer decisions you have to make have greater responsibility and potential importance. So the ones you've got to make, your high command for your ability to make good, sound judgment. But if your overall picture is incorrect in the first place, so basically the overall French policy is it's going to be basically exactly the same as the First World War, but with heavier guns and more concrete. So in other words, it's going to be long, it's going to be attritional, it's going to be largely immobile. As it turns out, they're kind of half right or half wrong, depending on which way you look at it, because it does turn out to be long and attritional, but it is never static, or very rarely static, only for a short period of time. So that's 2 of the reasons. The third reason is that they're just too top heavy. So there is, you need to you need to give your junior commanders latitude to think on their own feet, and there is the top heavy nature of the French command doesn't allow for that, and consequently morale has got really bad. People have been static, they've been a long way from home. Most of them are reservists who've been called up, they don't want to be there, they're pissed off, and as we've discussed quite a lot of times on this show, if you don't have morale, you haven't got much of an army, particularly when you're from a democratic nation like France. So that's three reasons. Third reason is the Army of the Air is an absolute shit show, even though they've got much the same number of aircraft as the Luftwaffe. They're all over the place. No one's talking to one another. There is no air defence system. There's no coordination whatsoever. So that's a big downer. And then the fifth one, and possibly the most important of all, is the lack of comms. And it's just this lack of radios, lack of ability to be able to communicate. And so no one can move, because you've got to go from army, you've got to go from high command to army group to army to corps to division to brigade, and every single time they're trying to do it through field telephones and dispatch riders, and it just gets stuck in the clog up of broken telephone lines, of streets and roads which are clogged with refugees. No one can move, and so no decisions are made, because no one is allowed to use their initiative because of the top heavy nature.
And you've got yesterday's news. Usually, you're using yesterday's news to make orders for tomorrow, and the problem is what's happening today.
Correct. You've summarised that in much more pithily and concisely than I have.
And that's what keeps happening to the French, isn't it? Is they keep planning something for tomorrow based on what happened yesterday. And the Germans are somewhere else completely already today.
And the absolute classic case is the counterattack at Arras, which takes place on the, if I remember rightly, the 21st of May. And what happens there is that is supposed to be a coordinated Anglo-French armoured thrust. And basically the French don't turn up. And the reason they don't turn up is because they just can't get the orders to the right people at the right time and the right speed. And as it is, this kind of half-hearted little thrust rather than a counterattack actually completely throws the Germans and is directly responsible for the halt order that comes.
And yet, what's interesting about that is that. Well, exactly, because although it's crucial what it achieves. I mean, it's one of those things where, because it's essentially a botched attack, they don't get the infantry up that they need. They haven't got proper radio comms, so you've got the guys in these Matilda 2s doing it with the officers doing it with hand signals, passing the orders on with hand signals, because they don't have the radios. And it's been this thing where they've been thinking about this doctrine, but they haven't really had the opportunity to try it yet. Whereas the Germans. And I think Poland is really important in this. The Poland's have at least given it all a run once. They've had a look at what they need to do and how they can improve things, which the British haven't had the opportunity to do. But you've also got, because the Arras counterattack is quite like what happens at Ston, where the French put in a counterattack with some Charbie.
That's right, yeah.
That go very, very well to start with, where the Germans, the Grossdeutschland are completely caught out by a counterattack. There's a guy who drives over, French tank commander, who drives over a line of German infantry, crushes them all, because they're all like paralysed with fear, and guns them all down, and inflicts huge losses. You get these odd sticky moments where, and that again, that's not a coordinated attack. That's like someone going, well, sod this, I'm going to go and get stuck in,
which makes you realise that had they been able to coordinate attack,
exactly,
it would have been all over.
I'm going.
It would have been all over.
That's where I'm going with that. Yeah, exactly. It's Corporal Jones. They didn't like it up 'em.
They didn't like it up 'em. They didn't like it up 'em because only just over 30% of the German army are trained. What's doing all the damage here is those 16 mechanized divisions out of 135 that are involved in KCLA. Which is the assault in the west. Just those 16 divisions are doing all the. They're doing 90% of the odds. Yeah. It's absolutely amazing.
But to get us to May the 26th, so you've had the halt order, you've had the close-up order that the panzers first get given, and then the halt order, and they stop. And Gort says, and this is in the wake of the Arras counterattack, Gort says, right, well, I'm getting over the canal line. I'm just going to do it.
Yes.
And he makes his own initiative, doesn't he?
Yeah.
On his own initiative, makes a decision and sees it through and gets the... And there are accounts of German units watching British... who've been told, the Germans have been told to stop, watching British units march past them, getting into the Dunkirk perimeter, which is amazing.
Yes, it is. It is absolutely amazing, and this is and people like the SF Totenkopf, they've had this bloody nose at Arras. They've been attached to Rommel's 7th Panzer Division. They've been involved in that attack there. They've been sent back. They're in a bad mood anyway. Then they get across the Saint Quentin Canal and then are told to pull back over it again. Pull back because of the halt order.
Yes.
Which is why when they then are allowed to attack, they go absolutely apeshit. And, there is the execution of 99 men and all the rest of it. But I'm jumping the gun here. But I think the other thing that's really interesting about this is what's going on in the air. And the big problem is that because there is no coordinated air defence system, the only way for the French Army of the Air and the RAF to actually kind of intercept the Luftwaffe is basically to just take off and hope that you bump into them. So what the Germans are able to do is go, right, let's hammer that airfield today. And so they sweep in at kind of 6 o'clock in the morning while everyone's still on the ground and shoot them up on the ground because the British and the French don't know they're coming. And so so the RAF is hemorrhaging fighter planes. And of course, Dowding, who is Commander-in-Chief of Fighter Command, is going, well, hang on a minute. And so he writes that famous letter, which sort of is the beginning of the Battle of Britain movie. What's really interesting about that is that doesn't really have any effect whatsoever. There's a line where Larry Olivier sort of goes, "That's precise. Churchill will have to read this." And he goes, "That's precisely why I wrote it." But in actual fact, it makes no difference whatsoever. What does make the difference is what Cyril Newell says, who is actually the chief of the air staff at the time. And Cyril Newell says, "Look, we've got to stop having them based over there. You can send over aircraft, but they've got to be based in southern England. And now that they're close into northern France, they don't need to be in France. It's the shooting them up on the ground that's the problem. They can hold their own in the sky. It's the kind of, And so actually what happens is although the RAF is withdrawn, I think the last planes come out of certainly of the northern bit by the 23rd of May, that is also the day that Fighter Command enters the fray. Because Fighter Command, which is built, designed, created purely to defend Great Britain, is suddenly operating over northern France. From Manston, Tangmere, Hawkinge, Westmoreland and all the rest of it, those airfields down in southeast England. But Fighter Command is over. And that's why I've always argued that the Battle of Britain starts then. Because it is in that last 10 days of May that suddenly we're up the creek and we're looking down the barrel. And it is when Fighter Command enters that battle, air battle.
But the Fighter Command's task then is very different to what it's been doing in the Battle of France anyway, isn't it? It's like you've got a perimeter, you know what you've got to defend, you've got shipping to defend, you've got the positions to defend, you've got to break up German attempts to raid the evacuation area. It's a more contained task that's approaching its actual role. So they find it's a better fit, don't they?
But to start off with, I think from kind of sort of 20th, 21st, 22nd of May, something like that, 32 Squadron, which is Hurricanes and which is operating from Biggin Hill, they are flying over to a forward field during the day in France, refueling, they've got some Mercs there and all the rest of it, some, ground crew, operating from there, then flying back to Biggin in the evening, because the one thing that is not allowed to happen is for Spitfires to land anywhere in
they're
northern France,
being
apart
hoarded
from on a beach in Dunkirk, of course, with their wheels down.
You
but what's happened by the 26th of May? It is absolutely clear. The decision has been made that the only way we're going to get out of this shtuck is to evacuate the BEF. That very morning, Calais falls. Calais is the closest part across the Channel to England. You know, the swastika is fluttering within vision of a decent pair of binoculars from Dover. Yeah. You know, suddenly, you know, those guns are now being turned at Gravelines, at Calais, at the Pas de Calais, are now being turned onto Channel shipping. Anything that's going back and forth. You know, this is a really perilous situation, and we've got to get those guys out. And you know, there is a serious worry that they're not going to be able to get anything more than just a teaspoonful of troops back across the Channel, and I think it's just everyone just can't believe what is happening. You know, it's so sudden. The shock of it after kind of 4 years of kind of keeping the Germans at bay in 1914 to 1918. Suddenly, it's all over in 10 days. You know, they have got to the coast by the 20th of May in 10 days.
Well, basically, the Germans. I mean, just if you take it from May 10th to the fall of Sedan, which is the critical
3
moment,
days.
The Germans achieved more than they did in 4 years. It's absolutely a fraction of the cost.
And on the morning of the 14th of May, that's where Paul Reynaud, the French Prime Minister, rings up Churchill and goes, you know, they're through at Sedan. We've lost. We have lost the battle.
Done.
And everyone knows that's true. You know, but what do? You know, I mean, what's Churchill supposed to do? You know, everyone's saying don't reinforce the French, and he goes, yeah, but they're our ally. You know, we're fighting side by side. You don't just stick the knife into your ally and go, sorry, mate, you're a bunch of losers. We're not going to support you anymore.
You do get a slight feeling, though. I can't remember who's written about this. That once this is all done, there's a sort of relief that we're not tied to an ally anymore.
Yes, huge one.
Right? Okay. We'll do this. We'll do this our way, and we'll get the Americans in any way we can. And, you know, make good references to recommendations to the devil or whatever, you know, like, and so on. But there is a sort of feeling, oh well, thank God we're out of that mess, because the diplomacy running up to the war of trying to get and then obviously the British government has done full perfidious Albion in the years running up to the Second World War.
Yeah.
So no one's hands are clean in this. But there really is there is some mistrust of the French political establishment and all that sort of thing.
Because of the fractiousness of French politics.
Yes, exactly. Because you don't know who you're going to be going to next. And of course, you know, I mean, one of the issues in the 30s with oppositional politics here is that you get this developing thing where, you know, it's the liberals who bring in the Treaty of Versailles. So the Conservatives are basically kind of opposed to it because that's what you do. You're the opposition. There isn't proper political consensus about Versailles, which is how you get this creeping sense that actually, you know what, maybe we overdid it with Versailles, and the Germans are within their rights to hoover up some of the territories they've lost, and then and because you've essentially got a Conservative government in the 10 years running up to the war, as a national government, whatever. It's got that tone in it as well as appeasement. So you've got and then the French can't make their minds up because, like you say, their governments are crazy paving, and you've got Front Populaire and all these different stuff, and massive rioting in Paris in the 30s, and all sorts of civil unrest. Like people think of the French rioting in the, you know, like the 60s as the sort of French civil unrest, a period of, and your Gilets jaunes now. That's a Vickers Tea Party to compare what was going on in the 30s.
Yeah, that's
proper,
quite right.
real insurrection in Paris.
There's a brilliant book by Piers Brendan about all this called The Dark Valley.
Yeah, The Dark Valley. It's an
fantastic book. It takes all the major Second World War combatants from Japan to France to
country by
really good.
Country by country, and each chapter sort of goes. Meanwhile, in Tokyo,
it was bleak.
No, it's really good. I mean, I would thoroughly if you want an immediate primer on the interwar years, or you've got someone someone you know is doing A level and you want them to, you know, read something different. That's the way. Which I've given Willow a copy and she's still not reading it.
I also think there's another thing at hand with the kind of relief of France being out of the war and Britain being on its own in inverted commas. Is also because I just think Britain has a kind of inbuilt superiority kind of thing going on, and it just likes bossing the show. It likes being in charge, you know, and its politicians and its commanders like being in charge. They don't like having to play second fiddle to the French.
I think you've absolutely hit the nail on the head there. I think that is entirely true.
Now we can be in charge. Now we can boss this. we're masters of our own destiny. We're no longer kind of on the.
But not yet. We're not. Not on May the 26th.
So
we're appealing to a higher power on the 26th of May. We are not the masters of our own destiny.
No, we are certainly not. So let's just go through this is what we're supposed to do 25 minutes ago. But it's the first day, so it's a biggie. So that's fair enough. So early in the morning, Calais falls. 9 a.m. first war cabinet of the day, where they just go, okay, so what do we do? How do we deal with that? 10 a.m. is the National Day of Prayer. It's the main service at Westminster Abbey, led by the King. So the war cabinet, the 5-man war cabinet, which is Churchill, Lord Halifax, Chamberlain, who was Prime Minister, Halifax, who's the most respected politician in the country by a country mile, Attlee and Greenwood from the Labour Party, who are new to the whole thing and are kind of slightly out of their depth at this point. Yep. They have to cut short their war cabinet and troop across the House of Parliament, across Parliament Square to Westminster Abbey. The Panzer halt order is lifted at 1:30, but this is where they suddenly start having comments, because it doesn't actually reach Panzer Group Kleist that the order has been lifted until the leading panzers until 8 o'clock that night. And then 2 o'clock is the second war cabinet of the day, and at 2:45 it breaks up because Paul Reynaud has flown over.
He's Reynaud's in town, isn't he?
Croydon, is met and comes in, and he meets with Halifax. Halifax, meanwhile, is having meetings with Bastianini, who is the Italian ambassador, and at 3:05, Churchill, Chamberlain, and Greenwood follow Halifax for this meeting with Reynaud. And at 4 o'clock, Reynaud leaves and flies back to France. Then they have another war cabinet that evening, and at 6:57 p.m, 3 minutes to 7 p.m. that evening, Operation Dynamo is launched. The decision is made to evacuate the British Expeditionary Force at Dunkirk. And at Dunkirk is an important caveat, because there are, of course, also British troops below the Panzer Thrust to the south. So suddenly what's happened is that Allied forces have been separated. They've been severed in half. There's those which are south of the Seine, or but they're still north of the Seine at that point. And there are, but south of the Army Group A Panzer Thrust. And there are those which are in this pocket, and then there's Army Group B coming around the north. So there are 2 divisions worth. There's the 51st Highland Division, 1st Armoured Division, bulk of it, and another kind of ad hoc force of British troops which are still kind of south of the German side. So it is Dynamo is only for those who are at Dunkirk. And that night, Churchill dines with Anthony Eden, who is a colleague of his, who is the
former Foreign Secretary.
And it's going to be Foreign Secretary again once Halifax is booted out. And Hastings Ismay, who is Churchill's military chief of staff. And over that dinner, none of them can barely eat. They're picking at their meal because they feel sick inside with anxiety and nerves. And for Churchill, who has this gargantuan appetite for everything, not to eat tells you just how bad it is. And while he's picking at his lamb cutlet, orders finally reach the advanced panzer divisions that the halt order has been lifted, and then they're off again. And that's where we're at on the night of Sunday the 26th of May. And from a British perspective, it looks really bleak.
This is rock bottom.
It's rock bottom.
It's rock bottom.
Yeah.
Right, great. Well, I think we've set the scene there for our week of rock bottom. Don't call it that, please, ladies and gentlemen. And we're going to be speaking to different people every day, I think, to help illustrate and discuss the issues. And first up, from the Naval Historical Branch, we have Steve Prince. Right, well, that's the scene set for the day, and now we're delighted to say we're joined by the head of the Naval Historical Branch, Steve Prince, who's going to basically put these two landlubbers straight on on the naval effort, Dynamo, at Dunkirk. Welcome, Steve. Thanks for joining us.
No, my pleasure.
And Steve, what we've done is we've just been going through the events of Sunday, the 26th of May, which I always think is amazing because it's a national day of prayer led by the King. And it's that kind of sort of, what that suggests to me is we're so up the creek, there's nothing left for it but to pray and hope, which is not great, is it, really?
And to reveal that so publicly, in a way.
Yes, it's one way of transmitting to the public, really, isn't it? Of exactly how deep you think you're, how up to your neck you are in it at this point.
Yeah, don't panic, don't panic.
Because
pray.
Because after all, the Battle of France has been reported, it sort of totters into disaster in the way it's reported back in the UK, isn't it? It ticks along nicely, and then it becomes quite clear that things have gone horribly wrong. Not quite in real time with events, because obviously no one really knew what was going on. But by this point, that it's quite clear what's hit the fan.
Yeah.
So, Steve, the situation now is by the 26th of May, it's absolutely clear that France is going to lose. It's absolutely clear that the BEF is in big shtuck. And yet Britain and France have sort of gone into the war extremely confident that it's all going to be fine.
Essentially, yes. I think the main thing, they see that there's basically a balance of forces between German military capability, industrial capability, and Britain and France, and that they can stand on the defensive was the initial plan till probably 1942, maybe 1943, slowly, systematically building up their industrial production, mobilising more troops, getting the BEF from the strength it was at in the summer of 1940, kind of 10 to 13 divisions, depending on how you count it, to kind of 35, 36 divisions. That Germany would have been worn down by an economic blockade, and that then you could turn onto the offensive slowly from 1942, 43, and that would be the route to victory. So this incredible success by the Germans in the summer of, over just 2 weeks in the summer of 1940, it's what I've called, it's a real strategic earthquake in terms of all the pre-war plans and calculations.
Yeah, so they're just, because it throws everything on its head, doesn't it? And suddenly, the impression I always get by that Sunday, the 26th of May, is that everyone back at home in England is just scratching their heads, just thinking, what the fuck are we going to do? It's just, everything has gone wrong. They're absolutely staring down the barrel. And most people don't seem to be thinking clearly.
I think that's probably fair. This was just a contingency in planning that nobody had thought was remotely feasible. We could see shades of... Much of our planning for the Second World War is really an attempt to refight the First World War, but without the same scale of casualties. And there are good things that we took from that. It's the idea that actually keeping in step with your allies is really, really important. Hence, we align ourselves very closely to the French, support them loyally, and this sort of thing. But the idea that you could have such a turnaround, and I suppose the closest is perhaps sort of France versus Germany in 1870. Where they'd had a success with this sort of attack. But everybody's memory and expectation is much more hooked around 1914-18, where you'd had a couple of periods of danger in 1914 and 1918, but the Germans had never made it to the Channel ports. So it did seem unimaginable to people that this could happen and happen so quickly.
And do you think, there is this sort of, obviously, people talk in military terms, they talk an awful lot about balance, don't they? About being on balance and off balance. And right now, at this moment, everyone's off balance. There's a plan being put into place for Operation Dynamo, which is rescuing the BEF, but that doesn't come into play until, that's not given the green light until the evening of that Sunday, the 26th. Do you think there's this sort of case where everyone's, people are so off balance, and they're just not really quite sure what to do?
I think that's fair. Yeah. So there is a case of sort of individual and selective just shock, trauma, of something that just seems, to some extent, COVID-19, 9/11. These are the sort of events that for us will give us some sort of touching point as just how dramatic that change is. But I think what you do have that's quite impressive is that you've still got commanders and staff. And this is, I suppose, Churchill's finest hour in the sense of he is looking to the future, whether reasonably or unreasonably. He is not giving in to the shock. And so he's got all sorts of ideas, some of which are reasonable, many of which are not. But it's more about getting back on the front foot on what we can recover. And I guess Dynamo is the most important one that emerges.
So at what point during the day does Dynamo actually start to sort of emerge, or by the evening, is it right? Okay, that's what we're going to do. I mean, but while the country's saying its prayers, people are rushing around in the Admiralty, surely saying, "Well, we've got ships here, we've got people there, we can bring this in. We'll need to do that. We'll redirect this, that, and the other." Is it being keyed together that quickly?
Yes. Yeah, so in the Admiralty, and the difference between the Admiralty compared to the War Ministry or the Air Ministry is the fact that you've got an operational HQ in London. So the War Ministry and the Air Ministry are kind of, allocating forces to commands out in the field. But because of the nature of kind of ships and moving them globally, you've got a protected bunker on the edge of Whitehall, just off Horse Guards, that you've got staff in there working. And so the Dynamo decision is made on the Sunday, and the execute signal goes to Admiral Ramsay at Dover that evening, and it's up churning the next day.
And one of the big challenges is how to get to Dunkirk, isn't it? Because it's not as simple as just sort of, what's the straightest line, let's go. Because there's mines, and there's guns on the coast which are manned by Germans, not French anymore.
Yeah, so there are also... I mean, you start from the fact that there's an awful lot of, the normal maritime hazard that goes with the routes anyway. There is shallow water, there are shoals, there are navigation, and there is a bit of a war between the different sides on navigation markers. So sinking each other's navigation buoys and this sort of thing. Then you go into exactly that. You've got attacks by aircraft, and you've got attacks by shore batteries. So though the route is perhaps sort of Dunkirk to Dover, probably around 40 nautical miles, you've got routes that you have to put in and mark out that can be anything up to 90 nautical miles.
How familiar was the Navy with Dunkirk? Had they been, when the BF was going in, the previous year, and while it was being kept in the field before the war proper starts on May the 10th, was the Navy familiar with Dunkirk? Was it one of the ports they'd been using?
It was on a secondary scale, and so one of the things that's interesting about the BEF is though the channel ports in that sort of northeast corner they were used almost entirely for just troop transfers. So this is leave transfers and troops. So because the ferry pattern predominantly in that part of the world it's a bit of freight, but it's mainly passengers going back and forth. So you've got familiarity, you've got Admiral Ramsay at Dover Castle, and again in the tunnels below Dover Castle, controlling that patch, mainly for the fear of Germans, maritime incursion to try and cut it. But one of the interesting things is most of the heavy lines of supply for the BEF are actually laid through Normandy. They're laid through Cherbourg and Le Havre, and then they drive up that bit of the coast. And that was put in partly because you've got big ports in Southampton and Portsmouth to big ports in Normandy and the coast and all the things that we'll learn about kind of 4 years later in the war. But also it was that to keep the lines of supply safe from air attack, to keep them out of range of German aircraft in northern Germany. So you've got familiarity, but, Ramsay, Dover Command was seen as a significant but kind of second-string command before all these events. So Ramsay is kind of thrust into the front of history.
But he's been retired as well, hasn't he? He's been retired, hasn't he?
That's right. He'd been retired. Retired at his own request in the late 1930s. He'd been working in a chief of staff job, and his admiral wouldn't let him get on with work, so he felt frustrated and quit. And he'd been brought back. He'd been kind of earmarked, if you like many retired officers, for a wartime role. So in the 1938, in the Czech crisis, he had already been earmarked for the command at Dover. So he has some familiarity with the job he's likely to go to. And he'd served there in the First World War as well as a destroyer commander. So he's got a reasonable level of familiarity with it. But it was thought that this would mainly be, if you like, a transit route with the threat of German naval or air raids, not what it became absolutely in the front seat.
So they'd better hope that he's up to it then, hadn't they? I mean, that's the other thing. I mean, you're suddenly thrusting a vast amounts of responsibility onto his shoulders, which he would never reasonably have expected to have thrust upon him. at this particular stage. I mean, it's quite a big thing, isn't it? To say, how you've just come out of retirement and we put you on this sort of, comparative backwater for the Royal Navy, and how you've just been transferring troops back and forth. Well, now we want you to oversee the entire evacuation of the BEF and some French soldiers as well, and you need to get on with it really, really quickly. Can you do it by kind of, be up and running by tomorrow morning? I mean, just imagine getting that call.
But was he given a blank cheque, though, effectively?
Yes, in many ways. So whatever resources that he could plausibly pull into that area. And so the main difficulty is getting stuff to him. But if there was anything he wanted that could be got to him, he is given the sort of first priority to get it. So he's given a lot of destroyers that are brought down the coast from other naval bases. We're obviously familiar with the little ships, but also there are basically a ton of coastal craft, of cross-channel ferries, of kind of ferries that are doing across from Portsmouth to the Isle of Wight, of a lot of the Dutch shipping. And one of our real resources that we don't talk about at all is there is a ton of Dutch shipping and other refugee shipping that has come over to Britain just, a week beforehand, which is immediately turned round and then used for the Dunkirk evacuation as well. So it's one of the first sort of really allied efforts, albeit a completely ad hoc one, of the war.
Yeah.
The Navy had done no contingency planning for this eventuality. Had they? It's not like it's not like I mean, you mentioned COVID, like the COVID-19 thing, where they at least have a pandemic plan file, and they get the box file down, obviously every other year, dust it down, and then decide that it's fine, and they put it back. There literally was no get the BEF out of France in a great big hurry plan.
The closest you would get would probably be a bit of almost kind of officer muscle memory of some of the 1918, where there was a chance of the Germans breaking through to the coast and cutting off the first BEF. So there is a little bit of sort of familiarity with that and with the ports, but to do the job, no, absolutely none whatsoever. What you have got, I suppose, though, is you've got officers who have been trained to deal with the kind of unexpected problems. And one of the perhaps most important qualifications for Ramsay is he'd gone to the Imperial Defence College, so the highest level kind of defence college available in the 1930s, both as a student, and then he'd gone back as the directing staff. So he was used to dealing with sort of sudden problems that involved Army, Navy, Air Force being set through that training. And that gave him a familiarity with a lot of the same commanders. So Alan Brooke had been at the Imperial Defence College. So you've got, that level of kind of familiarity that means they're starting with a blank page on the problem, but they're definitely not starting on a blank page with the kind of the mindsets and the networks to do it, I'd say.
Yeah, the other thing about the Royal Navy is it's just amazing how many different ships. I mean, when you think of the Royal Navy, you think of sort of battleships, cruisers, aircraft carrier, destroyers. In the case of Dynamo, it's mainly kind of destroyers that one thinks of. But there's a whole load of other things which are flying the white ensign, which, are not traditional naval craft, are there? There's lots of sort of trawlers and all sorts of other ships that are kind of sort of purloined and kind of brought into it. Drifters. What's a drifter?
So a drifter, effectively, you've got a drifter is one of a whole cast of kind of small ships that you're using effectively round naval bases to do things like lay nets, recover wreckage, recover torpedoes that have been fired for training. Right. So there are a whole series. We think of the Navy, you're quite right, as the big projects, the battleships, the carriers, down to probably the destroyers. So the ships that you lay down in peacetime that take, 2 or 3, maybe 4 or 5 years to build, that are big investments. But there is this whole supporting flotilla that you have some of in peacetime, but you can rapidly expand in wartime to make up the Royal Navy, to protect ports, to recover aircrew, to deal with a whole series of things. So trawlers, you've got a mixture of Admiralty-built trawlers that you can use for a whole series of kind of everyday tasking. It's almost, if you like, the big warships are there for the critical days, and then there are this whole supporting cast of players who are there for the typical days, day in, day out, patrol work, mine clearing, And on this occasion, getting to the beaches, getting a few people off, linking perhaps between the shore and bigger ships, this kind of thing. Some of them are manned by the regular Royal Navy, but this is where the Royal Naval Reserve, so you've got two sorts of reserve, effectively. The Royal Naval Reserve, who are the professional seamen, who have a reserve commitment to the Royal Navy, and the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve, They're sometimes called the yachtsmen, as some of them said. The trouble with the Royal Navy training, you could either do the training or do the yachting. You didn't have time for both. But these are people who are not specialist seamen, but have volunteered for the Navy in wartime. And they're the people who are manning more and more of these little flotilla ships. And by the end of the war, they'll be commanding the majority of them. Yeah. They'll be commanding, and it will have moved up to corvettes and frigates and this sort of thing.
But one of the things that always strikes me about British in Royal Navy in the Second World War is that, to start off with, it's the world's largest in September 1939. But you've got a kind of a base from which to rapidly expand anyway, because you can spread that professionalism very quickly. But because we're an island nation, because we're a nation where there are a lot of people who live on creeks and rivers and by the sea and all the rest of it, and know their kind of reef knots and know their jibs from their poop decks or whatever. You can tell I'm not a sailor. But there is a sort of base knowledge, which when you're suddenly joining the Navy, presumably is quite helpful, isn't it?
Yeah, particularly for that early expansion, for this sort of 1939-40. Later on in the war, you're bringing in an awful lot more people who don't have any experience, who often can't swim, and putting them through the Navy. But you're right. I suppose a Navy and Air Force, maybe to some extent an Army, in peacetime, it's kind of an all-regular spine of people that you can flesh out with some people who've got maritime experience you can top up, and then eventually you get to people who've got no maritime experience, and you can balance them off. And you could take that back to Nelson's time, where you would have had the professional sailors and then the landsmen in the crew. And as long as you've got a proportion of both to mix together, you can do it. You can expand. Probably the most remarkable expansion in this whole period is the fact that, of course, Britain's war is not really Britain's war. It's the Empire and Commonwealth War. The events of 1940 actually gets a huge kind of rocket boost from this. The Royal Canadian Navy has 6 ships in 1939, 6 destroyers. In 1945, it's got over 400 ships, and it's the third biggest navy in the world.
I mean, it's just amazing.
It's just a phenomenal expansion.
Never play down the contribution of the Canadians. I've learned over the years. In the air, on land, and at sea, they're amazing. And volunteers all. Yeah.
Incredible.
And volunteers all.
So what's the first order that Ramsay issues then? The following morning when the orders for Dynamo start to go out. What's the first thing on his list?
So effectively, I'd say the first thing is, first of all, working out what ships he's got first under his command and what he can then bring in from neighbouring commands. So it's trying to determine what level, and there is a constant during Dynamo, there is a debate about where to put the destroyers. So the numbers are going up and down almost every day, because you strip destroyers out of things like the home fleet and other bases, and you're taking risk with them. So you're trying to get to, balancing the risk off. And he gets up to, at different times, 30 plus destroyers. I think there are 41 over the whole kind of operation that serve. Then he's trying to gather in all these small craft that James is talking about. And then it's that problem with planning of thinking, right, the civilian craft aren't going to be with me on day 1 or day 2, but I need to activate them as early as possible. And while some of them come with their civilian crew, a lot of them are actually manned by the Navy for the operation.
Yes.
So it's trying to
they
do
say,
that.
Right, we're now taking this over, aren't we? Your boat here at Lowestoft, it's now ours for the duration.
Yes.
You can have it back next Thursday.
Which is the thing I remember as a child from the Falklands War. I remember that suddenly you've got the Herald of Free Enterprise and the Atlantic Conveyor and all these ships being seconded and are suddenly part of the Navy. Although they were merchant Navy crews, weren't they? But
famously,
yes,
and the QE2.
So the elegant phrase that we use at work is stuffed, which is ships taken up from trade is the technical term for it. And actually, interesting enough, the fleet
That's a
today...
brilliant acronym. I love that. Ships taken up.
So the fleet today still has Argus, a Royal Fleet Auxiliary, which was Contender Besant in 1982 when she was taken over for the Falklands War, and then she was brought into the fleet and has been kept on. And this is sort of a stage further, this sort of taking up merchant ships and ferries. They're referred to in the official history as passenger ships. They are basically the cross-channel ferries, or the ferries and the pleasure ships that are used on the Thames or to go across to the Isle of Wight. And after the destroyers, they are the group that take off the largest single numbers of troops from Dunkirk and bring them home. And then you get to this sort of third layer, as we talked about, where you're talking about yachts and pleasure craft and motor launches and things that are coming over. Some of them manned by their owners, but many of them actually taken over and manned by the Navy.
Gosh, so first he's doing his inventory, activating whoever he's got available to him, juggling what he can actually draw down from other duties around the British Isles and the western approaches. Then he's also got to talk to the army, which after all, which bit of the army? Because the army, you've got the army in London who don't really know what's happening in France. Gort is trying to actually run what's left of his battle. So immediately, is he talking to France, the army in France, first the BAF, or is he talking to London? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because after all, there's lots of. I mean, what's so amazing about this is there's lots of potential wrong alleys of communication you could bark up, and also how heavy is Churchill on this? How heavy are the war cabinet on this? Are they letting him get on with it, or are they on the phone every half hour going, "Have you done this yet?"
Oh, I think action this day and prompting, absolutely, yeah, and you can imagine, because I think Churchill is well aware. And I think Churchill deliberately probably sets expectations low. The idea that we're looking to recover 35,000 troops, that sort of thing, initially. And I think that's both to sort of scale, expectations. And frankly, Churchill's probably already worked out, if you can get more off, that's your first, in propaganda terms, turning this from defeat into a form of victory.
Right, yeah,
if you set the expectation that low. Because Churchill, I think people forget, he's become Prime Minister on the 10th of May. He doesn't become leader of the Tory party until November 1940, when Chamberlain dies. So he knows, as a Prime Minister, he's in a situation where only success keeps him going. So he's got to constantly build. He hasn't got a kind of automatic kind of inbuilt majority in the way that most Prime Ministers have. He does soon later as he establishes a track record, but it's not obvious from this point onwards. I think probably the most important thing Ramsay does is he sends Captain Bill Tennant.
Yeah, well, I was going to come on to him.
Over to Dunkirk. Yeah. He becomes the senior naval officer at Dunkirk. So he goes over to be Ramsay's eyes and ears to look at the reality and what can be done in Dunkirk, and getting him there within 24 hours as quickly as possible to make an assessment on the ground.
Yes, because he's working at the Admiralty, isn't he, on Sunday, and then he gets a call going, report to Ramsay in Dover, 0900 hours tomorrow morning. He gets there on time, having had a sort of driven through the night. Pitches up and goes, well, what's the gen then, Skip? And Ramsay says, we've got 24, 36 hours to do this, something like that. And he goes, okay.
Yes.
Gets on Wolfhound, I think, which is a destroyer, gets across there. He's there by about 5 in the afternoon, something like that. And I love the story about him suddenly realising he's got no kind of badge of authority whatsoever. So he tears up a cigarette paper, the silver of the liner of a fag packet, and sticks it SNO onto his tin hat with fish paste. It's absolutely amazing. And there he is, with his SNO on his tin hat.
Yeah. And it is that funny mixture of a naval party who are sort of half-garbed as army and half-garbed as navy that you see as the war goes on sort of various beaches, getting in or getting out again. The one thing we should say is, of course, the French have a naval headquarters at Dunkirk.
Oh, yes, it's
so
Admiral
what he can
Abrial,
do, he plugs into Admiral Abrial for a lot. So again, though we see it is very much a shared Anglo-French operation in that sense. So with Abrial, he does have someone to plug into to give him some of the realities on the ground, as well as plugging into the British Army as they fall back on Dunkirk.
Yeah, and Abril's headquarters have got a direct line straight to back to London, haven't they? Or straight to Dover. So that phone line is open. So Tennant can at least talk mano a mano to Ramsay.
Yes.
Which obviously makes a massive difference. Yeah. And also, of course, it's Tennant who discovers the East Mole is a potential jetty.
Yes, absolutely. And that's probably his biggest single contribution, is this idea that getting out through the main harbour, getting out over the beaches is going to be helpful, but it's just not going to deal with the volume that's required of getting people away. And I think it's also Tennant who is when he arrives, very clear about the fact this can only be about saving people. The priority is getting people back to Britain. Any hint that we can get any equipment off,
forget it.
Sort of just wishful thinking by this stage. It's got to be about people and a pretty crude and ruthless churning through a volume of people to get out. So accepting that there will be high risk and high casualties, but to get people off in volume and in time, that's what you've got to do. And so, yes, he's the one who pushes the mole. And again, there is a bit of sort of precedent and memory for this, because in things like 1918, so the raid on Zeebrugge, where the British put ships like Vindictive against the mole in order to land people, that's a case study that's then taught through the wars. And effectively what Tennant done has just reversed that. You can use the mole in order to get volumes of people off. You experiment with it, you see if the draft of the ships, the lack of wreckage and maritime hazard, and he works out, yep, we can do this. And then I can start really taking tens of thousands of people off.
It's amazing, isn't it? I mean,
it's still boggling the entire thing, and that it does come down to something just basically as simple as that, and him having like you say, the muscle memory, but also him having the clarity of thought, and actually that he's been delegated to make a decision like that.
Absolutely, I think that's the key thing. So Ramsay, from his career, having been frustrated a couple of times where he felt he was being sort of, people looking over his shoulder all the time at work, he was absolutely of the if you needed to, you just gave him kind of complete autonomy to do whatever he thought was necessary as the man on the spot.
That's all we've got time for today with Steve Prince, but don't worry, he's back tomorrow in day 2 of our Dunkirk special series. Bye for now.